What's going on, guys? The Nintendo Switch 2 has officially been announced along with all the details, so I've compiled all of it here in this video and what to expect so you can decide whether to make a purchase or not. There are many good things about the console, but unfortunately the bad far outweighs the good. Now, I'm personally a huge Nintendo fan. I've played every console they've ever had that has come into existence, and personally I was looking forward to playing The Legend of Zelda in 4K in docked mode, as the rumours had suggested for such a long time, but now with the official reveal it turns out you will have to sacrifice other things. Switch gamers who prefer to play in docked mode will have to think long and hard about each game they play and the consequences behind it, as for the first time docked mode seemingly cuts performance instead of increasing it, despite overclocking the GPU. Right now it's left us somewhere a bit confused far back in time and barely feels like an upgrade from the Switch 1. So first off, I'm going to be doing a deep dive into the hardware graphical power. Now for handheld mode it can do 1080p resolution up to 120 FPS. In the docked mode it can do up to 4K resolution at 60 FPS. And it is important to note that the vast majority of games in docked mode will not actually run at 4K. That's just the maximum potential of the dock. In that same respect, the vast majority of the games running in handheld mode will not actually run at 120 FPS. The display just supports that number of frames. Okay, so starting with docked mode. The console, when docked in an attempt to achieve 4K resolution, will be using something called checkerboard render upscaling. This is an AI upscaling method to upscale a lower resolution to a higher one. Now, developers of PS4 Pro titles used this technique way back in 2016 for most games when 4K first became available for console owners. For those that don't know what checkerboard rendering is, I will explain. Let's say, for example, you have a 1080p image and try to put it on a 4K screen. It will look blurry as a 4K screen has 4 times as many pixels. The screen essentially has to stretch the image out, making it look blurry and lacking quality. And this is exactly why HD videos used to look good when we viewed them on a 1080p TV, and now on modern 4K displays they don't look so good anymore. Each and every pixel will have a missing one next to it, as the 1080p output image won't have enough to fill a 4K panel. To resolve this, video game developers can take a pixel, copy and paste it to the missing pixels surrounding them to fill in the blanks, and this creates the illusion of a 4K image so it fits the screen, but it doesn't necessarily make it look sharper. So we know with checkerboard rendering it means instead of stretching the image out, it will fit the right number of pixels for a 4K display. As it's not natively rendering all new pixels for the scene, it will never look as sharp as an actual 4K image. So that's checkerboard rendering in a nutshell. The Switch 2 in docked mode will also use another technique called dynamic resolution. This is where the console targets a 4K image to output in games that support a higher resolution count, but the Switch 2 will automatically decide to drop the resolution down to something lower, let's say 1440p. And this is done in order to keep your frame rate stable at 60 FPS in scenes that demand a lot of graphical power. Again, this technique was used in 2016 on the PS4 Pro. Okay, so the Switch 2 is using a lot of methods in docked mode to compensate for its lack of ability to actually run 4K. We also know that in most cases, as Digital Foundry have noted, games like Mario Kart World are reportedly running at a resolution close to 1440p in docked mode, and this helps them keep the game running smoothly with the sacrifice of quality. Now bear in mind that this is their flagship console selling game, and it doesn't even come close to meeting the target 4K resolution of the docked mode. So as it's their flagship game, I would say that it's a good indication that in the future we probably won't actually see any real native 2160p 4K games at all. And this presents a very confusing choice for gamers who prefer to play on a TV. Docked mode is supposed to be an upgrade to playing on a handheld, as it essentially overclocks the GPU to unlock more power, hence why the dock itself now contains a fan unit. But in this case, it's an upgrade and a downgrade at the same time. It's a slight upgrade to go to a higher quality image, sometimes native 1440p, or 1440p that's been upscaled to achieve 4K with checkerboard rendering, but it's also a massive downgrade as the handheld mode has the potential to go up to 120 frames per second, and when docked it's only half of that available at 60 frames per second. The decision to cap the docked mode at 60 FPS is a poor one, and ultimately down to the fact that the dock contains the old HDMI 2.0 technology spec, and not the HDMI 2.1 standard which all other consoles have been using since 2020. As we all know, HDMI 2.0 is capable of running 1080p at 120 frames per second, but HDMI 2.1 unlocks the power to use 4K at 120 frames per second. There are so many questions to be asked here. Could Nintendo really not afford to put the newer connection in? And if it has HDMI 2.0, why couldn't they have just given us the option to run at 1080p 120 frames per second if the handheld mode already supports that? Is it that they already know their games will not be able to reach the potential of the quality? I'm betting on that one. But putting the frames per second aside for a moment, I'm really disappointed in the resolution being checkerboard rendered. And I don't see why docked mode couldn't just offer a native 4K image, since titles have been running native 4K 60 frames per second since 2016 on console hardware like the PS4 Pro. Now bear in mind that the Switch 2 costs more than that console at the time of release. Yes, the PS4 Pro used checkerboard rendering in some cases, but there were plenty of titles that ran a native 4K, including The Elder Scrolls Online, Skyrim Special Edition, all the FIFA entries, and so on. Even with that said, the PS4 Pro came out in 2016, which was 9 years ago, and the Switch 2 is already behind that before it's even been released into the public, and we're already at 2025 as it is. Moving on to handheld mode now, this is another major downgrade from the last iteration of the Nintendo Switch. There are two major problems here. The first is that it's once again a basic 1080p resolution screen for no real reason. No 4K, not even 1440p, just old school 1080p. And this is the old resolution standard which was introduced over 2 decades ago. I hear people saying, well that's fine, it's only a handheld, what did you expect? Well, I'm sorry, but that's no excuse anymore. There are other 4K handhelds out there for gaming. Hell, even phones are mobile gaming devices these days with better performance than the Switch 1 and have 4 times higher resolution. The second issue is that the panel type is also a downgrade. The last Switch had an OLED panel and the Switch 2 has gone back to a 2015 LED panel. This is an extremely disappointing move and makes no sense to say the least, as they have added HDR support for their games. HDR, or High Dynamic Range, means you will get an overall wider colour palette, but without an OLED panel you won't actually be able to take advantage of seeing any deeper black levels. As a result of using LED, the screen has to be backlit, and you will always see the light leak through to the display. Once again, it's an incredibly poor display to choose, considering that every major flagship smartphone from the last 6 years has already offered a better panel than the Switch 2 panel. My current phone I'm using now, which is not even top of the range model, has a 120Hz 4K OLED panel with variable refresh rate. Nintendo have not tried hard enough this generation with their displays, and you can't help but to think this has been done on purpose, so that later down the line they can sell you a Nintendo Switch 2 OLED. Next up is the games. Nintendo have completely done away with the old pricing model for their games and increased it by a huge amount. The price for Mario Kart World is going to be $80 in the US and £74.99 in the UK. And their justification for this? Well, you can drive around in an open world. I'm not even sure if Nintendo are aware of this, but we could do that anyway in 1999 on a game called Crash Team Racing for the PS1, and that game is currently less than $10 for the remaster on PS4, and I have absolutely no idea what Nintendo are thinking here. Their games include no premium ray tracing features, generally lack anti-aliasing overall, and they have also announced that their SD cards used for the Switch 1 won't even work with the Switch 2, despite being exactly the same spec and model. Another decision that makes no sense. The final confusing decision is the seemingly good idea to make some games from the GameCube catalogue available on the Switch 2 if you have the premium subscription, but they've chosen to use the original old versions and withhold HD remakes like The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker HD. They aren't even available to buy on the store if you wanted to. Another graphical decision that just doesn't quite add up. Moving on to other features now, the new addition of a game chat function is now available on the Switch 2, but I'm not going to praise this as it's more than 2 decades overdue, and most of us have been using a party chat feature since the Xbox console in the year 2002. Just take a moment to realise that's 23 years ago. Another controversial topic is that there's a dedicated C button to use chat. And since the new game chat feature is subscription and paid only, it means that you literally won't even be able to use the available buttons on your Switch 2 unless you pay. They would have been better off leaving this button out entirely and just replicating the same as what Sony and Microsoft are doing. The final feature everybody seems to be talking about, and I think is extremely overrated, is the ability to use the Joy-Cons as a mouse. Now for PC users who prefer mouse and keyboard, I guess it would be an okay thing, but I for one couldn't care less about this at all. It seems like a total gimmick which will be used in 1 or 2 games and then completely forgotten about for the rest of its lifetime. Not to mention, it will only be available if the developers for the games choose to implement these mouse-style controls. And Nintendo has a very bad history of inventing peripherals and then abandoning them completely. Take the light gun from Link's crossbow training, for example. Now, in summary, Nintendo have a history of being innovative and have reinvented the wheel like they did with the Wii, which put motion controls in the mainstream before anyone else. But they do also have a history of making mistakes by releasing multiple versions of the same console, such as the Wii U, which flopped pretty badly. The original Switch had 3 versions already spanning over 7 years. Now, almost a decade later, we were all anticipating their next console, and we have another variation of the Switch, with a missed opportunity to call it the Super Nintendo Switch as well. Upon closer inspection of what upgrades are on offer, I'm sad to say as a Nintendo fan of over 30 years, the Switch 2 also falls into that same Wii U category. All in all, I really wanted Nintendo to succeed with this one, but it really feels like they didn't learn anything from the mistakes of the Wii U. A second iteration of the same console has rarely ever worked out for them, with the exception of the Game Boy lineup, which had various successors, but that was over 20 years ago and technology has completely changed. And there's already been several versions of the Switch as it is. Now with the Switch 2, barely anything's changed, they're selling it at a far higher price point and the games to boot. For more tech content, check out the channel. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.